Since ARK Survival Evolved's full release from early access in 2017, nearly 8 years ago, one mystery has been staring us in the eye ever since we first stepped foot into the final boss arena on the island. That mystery being the moon, and the state we see it in during the battle against the Overseer, and again in Scorched Earth's Ascension, then Aberration, and if you're playing ASE, the entirety of Extinction, where it even has the rare chance to cause solar eclipses. Yet despite how prevalent the moon's presence seems to be, we've never been told what exactly happened for it to suffer such cataclysmic damage. That is, I believe, until now. 8 years later in ARK Ascended's upcoming Lost Colony DLC. Of course, we all know by now what happens to Earth. How the element war between the humanists of the Terran Federation and the transhumanists of the URE caused element to proliferate throughout the planet, destroying its habitability and setting into motion the construction of both the ARKs and the Genesis colony ship. Naturally, one might assume that it was this very war that resulted in the moon's destruction. Be it a show of power from either of the nations on a grand scale or something else entirely. And while there isn't enough evidence on a surface level to confirm nor deny this assumption, I'd like to put a pin in that, because I haven't been entirely truthful with you all. You see, I was lying when I said we've never actually been told what happened for the moon to suffer such cataclysmic damage, as we actually have, more or less. Thursday, September 24th, 2020, just over 5 years ago. ARK's then lead writer Mark Soskin hopped on r/ARKlore as part of an Ask Me Anything put together with the help of u/Diamond Creeper. And from that ancient AMA comes one question I'd like to turn our attention to specifically, which came from none other than our very own Redgear17, a very good friend of mine who helps me in writing my videos behind the scenes.
Why has the moon blown up? I don't know if I missed it somewhere, but after collecting most of the Explorer notes, I never find a reason to why the moon is destroyed.
Mark's answer to all of this, to the mystery of the moon, is that it was just randomly inserted into the island's ascension one day and it stuck. The reason it's never brought up in the Explorer notes simply being that he had never intended for the moon to be destroyed in the first place. Now I know what a lot of you might be thinking. Okay, well if that's the case, then why make a video on it? What's the point? The point being how deeply the moon ties into Lost Colony, as I had mentioned at the very start of this video. First and foremost, I'd like to give a huge thank you to Raz Clark for uncovering this a couple months back. And an even bigger apology to you all for not having the time to cover it sooner. But there's been an interview, a series of interviews actually, between co-founders of Studio Wildcard, Jesse Rabzak and Jeremy Stieglitz, and PC Games Network, in regards to ARK Survival Evolved, ARK Survival Ascended, ARK 2, and, most importantly, ARK Lost Colony. The interview we're going to be looking at today in specific is called ARK Survival Ascended Devs Give 3 Reasons Why So Many Have Stuck with ASE, written by James Hoare. In it, Jeremy talks quite a bit about how ARK Ascended split the player base with its demanding system requirements, lack of certain content, both pre-existing and new, etc, etc. He also mentions how we the players should be expecting an ARK 2 release in approximately 2 years, which I don't think anyone buys for even a second. Sorry, Jeremy. The most important takeaway from this interview, however, comes from something Jesse mentions offhandedly right at its very end. In reference to Genesis Part 2, he says the following, and I quote, "We did the most storytelling, and it's the most ambitious expansion in a lot of ways. I really liked that it was a fork of the original story, and that it was tying into the future storytelling in ARK 2. And the team really got to do a little bit of what we're doing now in Lost Colony, which is exploring a new story, a new setting, reimagined creatures and aesthetics, even crazy stuff like the Lunar Missions, which were just so far out there from what we had originally done in ARK. Now, I don't know if this was a Freudian slip on Jesse's part, or if he actually anticipated for us to latch onto this little nugget of information, which, mind you, has yet to be revealed in any official context, but from sources I obviously can't reveal, I can confirm that lunar missions are something which exist in Lost Colony. But I wasn't told anything other than that they are indeed real. Now, this is really interesting for several reasons. The first reason being the fact that Jesse explicitly said during Extra Life 2024 that missions wouldn't be present in Lost Colony as a way to stop players from beating the map right away. As some of you crazy people tend to do, you know, beating a new map that took 5 months to make in less than 5 hours.
Because one of the things that I don't like so much is when we release like a brand new map or expansion, and people instantly feel like it's just a new map, and they can just they just like are super powerful. Like, and I know we kind of like hedge that a little bit with like not allowing transfers for a while and so forth, but inevitably it still just feels like people within 12 hours have completely dominated everything there is about the new map. And so part of this is with this new expansion is to think about how can we create a longer tail for an environment that hunts you and isn't just about you hunting things. For Genesis, the missions were kind of intended to do that, but I don't think super successfully, unfortunately. And, you know, like, I think they added some fun, like, things to waste your time with, but they didn't really, like, change the nature of the game because they effectively weren't threaded into your kind of day-to-day living experience of the overworld, so to speak. So it's not about, you know, missions to try to kind of add that layer of threat this time around.
Now, to be entirely fair, Jeremy didn't outright say that missions weren't going to be a part of Lost Colony, just that they wouldn't be there to slow players down. Though I'd be lying if I said that's not the impression his statement initially gave me. If anything, and this is going off of his word, I can see lunar missions existing almost entirely separate from how you progress in Lost Colony. Unlike the Genesis expansions, they may very well just be there as added side content and a good way to get loot. Now, what am I hoping for? I think Genesis missed a huge opportunity with how missions played into the story. Instead of acting as a sort of ladder for you to actually progress the story in order to reach the final boss, missions instead were a barrier of entry, making it so that if you didn't complete X amount of this, that, or the other thing on Genesis 1 and 2, you'd be unable to fight the Corrupted Master Controller and Rockwell Prime respectively. And the missions themselves didn't really bring anything to the table narratively. Gen 1, for example, had you completing them with the vague goal of passing the Genesis simulation. Gen 2 had marginal improvement as you were actually going between the colony ship and simulation trying to take back control of them both from Rockwell, but even with that being the case, none of these missions had any real lore or plot relevance. Mainly just standing in as a way to hard cap your progress on a map where Wildcard decided to give you a fully functional tech suit on spawn. Tangent aside, all of this is skimming over the relevance these lunar missions are supposed to have with the real bread and butter of this video. The moon, whatever that's meant to entail. As I've already mentioned, the moon has always been a mysterious, unexplored plot thread in the story of ARK. The mystery only deepening when you take a look at ARK Ascended's new rendition of the Extinction DLC. One crucial detail I intentionally haven't brought up until now is how we see the moon in Extinction Ascended, or more accurately, how we don't see it at all. Unlike its evolved counterpart, where the moon is visible and causes solar eclipses, Extinction Ascended has no such event. In fact, wait around as much as you'd like, but you'll never see the moon over this side of the Earth. It's missing, gone without a trace. In my first video dedicated to Lost Colony, I had just assumed that this was a graphical error, and that the moon was intended to make an appearance, but due to time, Wildcard was unable to fit it in before launch. But no, now I see how wrong I really was. This is no graphical bug, no inconsistency, none of that. I am now led to believe that this detail is instead an active retcon to the pre-existing ARK Survival Evolved narrative. and that the moon is now functionally and canonically locked to the frozen half of the planet. As for why that is, that's another thing I'll get back to, because first, I'd like to go over how that's even possible. Scientifically speaking, in any realistic circumstance, the moon has to be orbiting the Earth at all times to keep it from crashing into the planet and ending all life as we know it. What keeps this from happening is the moon's sideways velocity, which essentially keeps it in a perpetual state of falling while missing Earth. And if you were to take away this quote-unquote fall, the moon's tangential path would then shift to a radial one, and it'd be pulled directly into the Earth due to its gravitational field. Contact is made, everything dies, the end. And even if the moon could hypothetically be locked in one place without colliding with the planet, that would bring into question complications regarding sea levels, tides, etc. Which, albeit might not be an issue for the very dried up and waterless Earth we see in extinction, but to a post-reseeded planet laden with oceans, rivers, and lakes, this could pose some pretty big ones. Putting aside the science, one thing is abundantly clear, and it's that the moon is not orbiting the Earth. Something, somewhere is holding it in place. But why? Running under the assumption that Lost Colony is indeed where we'll be getting an explanation for the moon's broken state, it's just as likely that it'll also hold the answer as to why its orbit has gone stagnant. We don't yet know the true extent of ARK Prime's tech, besides the existence of the superluminal link, which connects the city in some way to the Genesis colony ship. What we do know, however, is who lives there. The Lost, who I have theorized before to be the descendants of the original colonists left to stave off the apocalypse at ARK Prime. I want to avoid rehashing a lot of the previous points from my last Lost Colony video, so check it out here if you'd like to know more, but the gist of it is that the Lost Colonists are what would appear to essentially be element vampires. Now, I'm not so sure anymore if the Lost and the monster seen in the original Lost Colony teaser are one and the same as I had initially reasoned, but I do believe the two of them to have similar ties. Maybe even to the point where the monster is just a more feral or far gone version of the Lost. Whichever the case, I'm not sure. I would also like to point out that I was originally calling these things the Named, but since then the term Thrall has been found in the dev kit in direct relation to them, so going forward, I'll be referring to them as such. But that's neither here nor there. I'm getting off topic. A large part of that last video was going over the motives of the Lost Colonists, and why they are actively aiming to undo the reseed protocol. My current theory is that, due to their vampiric nature, having been shaped and molded over centuries by an eternal night, a post-reseeded Earth which is no longer tidally locked poses a prevalent issue. The return of sunlight to what would have otherwise been a side of the globe completely obscured in darkness. And as I've previously cited, to those familiar with how vampires are typically portrayed in modern media, it should be clear why this is a problem for the Lost Colonists of ARK Prime. That's because, like a lot of other typical monsters, vampires burn under the light of day. Though, knowing what I know now, I think my original theory was only half correct. Sunlight is essential for all life. Maybe not for vampires, but the UV radiation the sun emits is crucial for things like photosynthesis and planet habitability. Something I never really gave a second thought about from the original Lost Colony teaser, and probably should have, were these. Trees. Pine trees, to be exact, growing in the outskirts of ARK Prime. This shouldn't be possible, seeing as ARK Prime is on the side of Earth opposite to the sun, meaning that none of the required sunlight to sustain plant life should be present in the area. Unless, of course, you had something to reflect, and maybe even concentrate sunlight onto the frozen side of the planet. I believe not just that the moon is locked to this side of the planet, but that it, in some way, had been intentionally done in order to prevent a total blackout, in turn enabling plants, animals, and humans to at the bare minimum, survive the long cataclysm. It was a question of mine how exactly we were even able to see anything in the Lost Colony teaser, assuming total darkness to have been the case. But this, without a doubt in my mind, not only disproves that idea, but is the ultimate answer to the why. Now, as for what exactly is keeping the moon in place, I don't know, and we likely won't know until Lost Colony releases. But whatever it is, I'd wager with a level of certainty that it has something to do with the city of Arap Prime, and whatever crazy tech they have there, because again, we don't yet know the full extent of what the Lost are working with, nor what they're capable of. Maybe, just maybe they were capable of harnessing the moon itself. With the how and the why out of the way, I'd like to return to the what in this equation. What the hell even happened to the moon for it to be this way in the first place? To be shattered across the night sky? Because I feel now more than ever that we'll get our explanation in Lost Colony. Mark may still be a good resource to turn back to when addressing a lot of ARK's older lore. But you also need to understand that he left ARK behind half a decade ago by this point, and we've since watched the game's story get passed into the hands of two different lead writers, David Noonan, who wrote Genesis Part 1, and Peter Fries, who wrote Genesis Part 2 and is currently writing for Lost Colony, ARK 2, and likely some other things we don't yet know about. My point here is that his pre-existing explanation for the moon isn't as reliable as it once was. Sure, it may have just shown up like that one day without elaboration, but we now know, or at least assume, that there's more context being added, and things will likely get taken deeper in Lost Colony. How deep exactly, I can't say, but there's one theory I'm ruling out personally here and now, and it's the idea that the moon was destroyed as any sort of collateral or intentional attack during the Element Wars. I say this specifically because, despite hailing from the turn of the 24th century, that being the era of the Element Wars, none of Aberration's survivors mention the shattered moon, even offhandedly. Not Diana, nor Santiago. Not one of them brings it up. And sure, we already know that that's because Mark very intentionally never took the moon into consideration. But if we're being consistent here, then we're actively led to believe that nobody knows what exactly happened to it. And how do I know that nobody knows? Because nobody knew that the planet the ARKs were orbiting was Earth until they themselves made it planetside, where Santiago confirmed it in person. This is extremely important because if the moon had been destroyed as a part of the Element Wars, Earth would have been immediately recognizable to the survivors of Aberration, rather than being referred to as just some planet. The reason being obvious. If the survivors were preemptively aware that the Earth's moon had been shattered, seeing it outside the space station would quickly make them recognize their location. Since the chances of finding yourself stranded above any old planet with an identically broken moon like that is generally slim to none. Though, this doesn't account for the moon potentially being broken during a later stage in the war, as the collective memories of the survivors of Aberration were cut off towards its beginning rather than its end. If this is the case and the moon was destroyed sometime near the war's end, it would explain the survivors not recognizing it. But you also have to remember that the version of Santiago we see in Genesis Part 2 also never makes a point to bring it up, despite having been respawned shortly after the Element War's conclusion to work on the Genesis ship. So if the moon was broken and everything by this time, I feel like he would have had to at least allude to it at some point. Before I wrap up this video, I want to talk a little bit more about lunar missions and how I think they're going to tie into the moon as a whole. I know I got a little sidetracked with explaining what happened to the moon, more than I've been theorizing about the missions, but said explanations are going to be useful, even prerequisite to what I have to say about the missions. First and foremost, there's no argument as to whether or not lunar missions tie into the moon, given their namesake. But as for how they are or aren't intended to weave together the intricate tapestry that is what's ultimately going to happen to the moon, there are two main objectives in my mind. For one, we have to get the moon back to orbiting the Earth, because if we don't, and whatever is keeping it in place deactivates or shuts off, it's going to strike the planet and wipe out all life, effectively rendering every action taken in the story up until Lost Colony useless. And even if the moon was fine to stay stagnant on the frozen side of the Earth, that'd still leave us with irregularities in the flow of water on the planet. So regardless, it's gotta go back to its normal orbit one way or another. For two, so long as the moon stays shattered, Earth will be subject to the same catastrophic meteor showers we see in extinction. In fact, it's reasonable to infer that the moon is the direct cause of such showers, because, believe it or not, if the moon were destroyed in such a way as we see it in ARK, it would rain down hunks of lunar rock not for decades nor centuries, but for millennia. With the primary objective of the reseed protocol being to make the planet habitable again, allowing the moon to remain in its current state is directly counterintuitive to that goal. As for how lunar missions would solve these two issues and what they would entail, I imagine of all things that we may very well be going to the moon itself. Another crazy take, I know, but just think about it. Not only was one of the first big ARK mods from back in the day about surviving on the moon, but it's been something teased at before, in that of Genesis Part 1's lunar biome.
According to that data from the glitch, this is supposed to be a moon, but not the moon. Not the one we see in Earth's sky, anyway. At least it doesn't rain. Unless you count the meteors. Yeah, I reckon we should count those.
That, and ARK Moon Survival is also one of the select 26 accounts Jeremy Stieglitz follows on Twitter. If anything, to me this shows an interest, if not intent, to explore a proper lunar biome sometime during ARK's lifespan. And this very well may be the chance Jeremy has been looking for. And if we're going to the source of the damage, the obvious reason would be so that we could fix it. How exactly that would even be possible, given the scale of the moon and the scope of the damage, again, I don't know. But it's gotta be fixed, or else Earth's in for a hell of a bad time with all the space debris constantly raining down on everything. Alternatively, I've also been proposed a theory that suggests that lunar missions may be dependent on the lunar cycle, which would be cool and all, but to my knowledge, lunar cycles could only exist if the moon was orbiting the Earth, which, as we've discussed at length throughout this video, wouldn't appear to be the case. Unless, of course, I'm wrong about everything and Wildcard simply forgot to add the moon to extinction, which would not only make this entire video a waste of time, but might also be the funniest thing to have happened to me in a good while. That said, let me know what you think about my theories in the comments below. Why do you think that the moon is destroyed, and do you agree with the idea that it's been locked to the frozen side of the planet? How are lunar missions going to work? Will they have any narrative significance if they aren't a requirement for the final boss? Let's discuss, and as always, I'd like to thank you for watching. Consider leaving a like if you liked this video, subscribe if you'd like to see more, and hype it for the algorithm. I'd like to give an extra thank you to my patrons for their continued support of the channel, including Nathan Hildebrandt, HeyNoQuest, and Jeremy Stieglitz of the Ascended Survivor tier. See you all in the next one, survivors.